Hello, everyone. Welcome to Training Institute Striking Services.
Hello, my name is Michelle Zabel and my pronouns are she and her. I'm an assistant dean at the University of Maryland School of Social Work and the proud director of the Institute for Innovation and Implementation. Today, I'm just delighted to welcome you to this Training Institute live workshop. As you might have come to expect with all your favorite conferences, the Training Institutes are now virtual. And although I know we'd all like to be together in person, we are excited to host the Virtual Training Institutes and really want to encourage you to continue to join us on the first Thursday of every month through August. Each month, you'll have a choice of 2 back-to-back workshops. So mark your calendars, choose your workshops, and make sure you reserve your place early so that you can attend the workshop that most interests you. Today, I want to encourage you to actively participate by using the chat to post your questions, post your comments, and share your resources with your colleagues. Our presenters, they definitely want to hear from you. And it is absolutely your participation that will make each of these sessions a success. As a reminder, staff are monitoring the chat and they're going to make sure the facilitators see your questions and comments, so be sure and engage. A few other reminders to include: if you need assistance at any time navigating through these virtual spaces or accessing links to workshops, we do have a live help desk support standing by to assist. We are also providing a certificate of attendance after the completion of each workshop, and all of our workshops are being recorded, so by you participating, you're implying consent. Finally, an ASL interpreter will be present during each session. The interpreters can be pinned for those who require interpretation by hovering over the interpreter's video and selecting the 3 dots. One of the options that will appear is pin video. By selecting the pin video, this video will not move out of view. Following the workshop, we will have a wellness and mindfulness break with guided activities before our second afternoon session. With our theme, What Could Be? Bolder Systems and Brighter Futures for Children, Youth, Young Adults, and Their Families, all of our sessions will challenge us to envision a future where the voices of children, youth, young adults, and their families are elevated, especially those who are most frequently silenced or marginalized, where we use the best data and research available to challenge ourselves, developing new ideas and approaches that can be implemented to meet the needs of youth and families, and in service of our commitment to social justice and the elimination of disproportionality and disparities. My hope is that today's session will provide you with food for thought as you consider your next steps in creating a vibrant, equitable future for youth with complex needs and their families. Please don't forget to register for next month's workshop. Remember, they're held the first Thursday of every month, and you can visit the institute.umaryland.edu for the full schedule. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next month.
Hello, everyone. How are you today? Good afternoon. Welcome to Strengthening Services by Using Evidence and Partnerships. I'm Jessie Watrous, and I am the Evidence-Based Practice Director at the Institute for Innovation and Implementation, University of Maryland School of Social Work. I'm joined today by my co-presenters, Bob Franks and Sue Kearns. And I'd like to actually ask them to just go ahead and say a word of introduction for themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bob Franks. Glad to be with you here today. I've worked in the implementation field for over 20 years and really happy to share my experiences with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Kearns. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Effective Interventions at the University of Denver, and I'm a Research Associate Professor in the Graduate School of Social Work. And likewise, very excited to be here today and looking forward to presenting some of the exciting work that we've done as it relates to effective practice for young people.
And we are excited to be here today. We're actually kicking off a series that I'd like to go ahead and invite you to, if this session is something that really interests you, to go ahead and join the series of sessions that we're kicking off today. So our next one will be on March 11th at 2:30, and it's going to be looking at population assessment to be able to align EVPs with needs and strengths. And then roughly every other month thereafter, we're going to have a subsequent session that'll go deeper on all the topics that we're going to cover today. And so hopefully you'll join those. Thank you. So what we'd like to do next is actually get to know you a little bit. And really, one of the things we want to know is, what is your level of experience with evidence-based programs and practices? One being least experienced or no, so really having no experience or knowledge of EVPs, to 5 being very experienced. So we're going to pull up a poll here. Excellent. So as you folks can see here, we have a great group. They all have at least some, you'll all have some experience with EVPs. So we'll hopefully be able to kind of get into, kind of the nuances of these EVPs and how do we approach them. The majority of folks have somewhat of an experience. So thanks so much for letting us know, and we'll work with you hopefully to tailor some of our presentation to that. All right, so what are we going to do today? This is our agenda. We're going to we want to first just have a conversation about the promises and the limitations of evidence-based programs and practices, and acknowledge really what we've found to be some enduring lessons. Those lessons then we're going to really touch on in the second section of our agenda, where we're going to kind of help you apply those lessons hopefully to your everyday work life. The first, I wanted to start out with this idea of the need for a common language when we talk about evidence-based anything. There are a myriad of terms that we use. You might have heard things like evidence-informed or research-informed, best or promising practices, practice-based evidence, evidence-based practice, most recently supported and well-supported, model programs versus evidence-based programs. So to help you kind of start to untangle some of that, I wanted to offer kind of 2 ways of starting to think about that. And the first is to really think about the subject of that research. So, and the second is the idea of the quality and types of research. So that gets at the idea, the first idea is that the subject of the research can be programs, practices, policies, even sometimes we talk about procedures and those kinds of things. But that gets at the first idea. And to help you understand a little bit about the differences between those, we really think about practices as the behaviors of the practitioners, recognizing sometimes that practice can really just be informed by data. We talk about programs, which are sort of bundles of activities, and of course policies. Those can range from everything kind of set by the city council at the local level to the federal level, where you're talking about like the Social Security Act. So those are kind of how I think about programs, practices, and policies. The next important concept I'm going to talk a lot more about is this idea of research quality and types of research. And that will help you. That's really how we get at the idea of what evidence is. So we want you to really, this is kind of how I think about what evidence-based programs and practices are. And for this presentation today, we're going to focus really on practices and programs, not so much policies. But how I think about defining EBPs, and by that I mean the practices and programs, as I said, the way I think about that is kind of in 4 categories. The first is just demonstrated impact. So we want to know that there's positive impact for youth and families. And really without, sometimes we find very surprisingly that there can be negative impacts, even with the best intentions of programming, which is why we need to do the evaluations often. There needs to be clarity on who we have positive impact for. So that's the first component of what makes, sort of a characteristic of what makes an evidence-based program. The second is about that evaluation design and quality. So we want high quality, rigorous evaluation. The third is the clarity of the logic model. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this more later, but this idea that programs should have a clear articulation of what is core to the model and what is peripheral to the model. Evaluators tend to start to think about this just through the development of a logic model, or you articulate your inputs, outputs, activities. And so as a program practitioner, that's a great place to start when you're thinking about that evidence building continuum. The last thing I'm going to talk about is just this dissemination readiness. So all of us who work in this field of evidence-based programming see significant differences in this area in terms of readiness for dissemination. And by readiness, I'm talking about, does it have the training materials, the fidelity measures, the coaching, and other supports that help ensure that the program is implemented with a high quality and fidelity. So this is how I think, I think folks, just to kind of demystify what is evidence building. And it starts for all of us who do programming with youth and families with a strong program design and CQI system. So I was just talking about that, having that logic model and building a CQI system, a continuous quality improvement system that collects the data that helps you understand if you're having impact and kind of how you're measuring the adherence to the inputs and activities that are important to that program design. And so once you kind of get that established in terms of evidence building, you can start to really look for the indicators of positive outcomes. So pre-post indicators that all of us can do doing any kind of programming. When you've started to get those kinds of supports articulated and in place, that's when you can start to look towards evaluation. And evaluation, of course, is how you get that evidence. So you'll do that, if you're interested in doing this kind of evidence building, you'll want to partner with an evaluator to conduct a high quality, rigorous evaluation. And you'll see when we're looking at clearinghouses that we share that information through peer-reviewed publication. And as those studies are repeated, the program is disseminated in different contexts, that's what really leads to that strong evidence. And we're going to talk about kind of levels of evidence more specifically in terms of clearinghouses and how to find that and look at that in just a little bit. But I think that this creates a pathway for anybody who's interested in being part of this process of evidence building. So this just provides some examples of evidence-based programs and practices that address behavioral health challenges. And we do want to acknowledge that, a lot of evidence-based programs and practices, you'll see more in the behavioral health field than probably any other area, I would say, maybe education, possibly next. And of course, that's because of the overlap with the health field where a lot of this work came out of. So here's just to kind of give you some examples of evidence-based programs, so you get a sense of, everybody here was a little bit familiar, but you can kind of get a sense of this. And I would be absolutely remiss as someone who's been doing EVPs for a long time not to then talk to you about one of the most important concepts, which is that really effective effective interventions or evidence-based programs without effective implementation are not going to yield to your positive outcomes. It's really essential to think about having the supports in place to ensure that those programs are implemented effectively. And then there's this concept of enabling context. And that is often everything from your sort of systems and your partnerships, and sometimes even the things a little bit out of your control, like a pandemic. So, and in the space of evidence-based program, when we talk about effective implementation very specifically, with using the word fidelity. So this is just really one measure of effective implementation. And what goes into measuring fidelity is measuring adherence and competence. And I found that to just be such a helpful concept when I started getting into this work, because adherence is often the easiest thing to measure. It's really, did you follow the recipe that was outlined for you? Competence gets at the idea of, if you really use the recipe analogy, were your ingredients fresh? Or what went into the practices that you implement with such good adherence. So that gives you the idea of fidelity. And this is an old study, but it was one that showed that the impact of fidelity when they studied adaptation of functional family therapy called functional family parole. And when we do, the studies that look at the comparison groups for when studying EBPs, or what we hope would eventually be determined to be an EBP, we have a control group. And in this study, they compared the control group, which is often referred to kind of as business as usual. We didn't know what the control group was here, but we do know that the therapists that followed the FFP model with adherence, their clients had better outcomes than the therapists who did it without adherence. And actually, very surprisingly, the control group did better than the non-adherent therapists. So I think it's a really stark example of the impact of quality implementation and fidelity. So you might, with this whole presentation, we want to ask you to really engage in a couple of questions. We ask you to really be questioning, why bother? Why look at EBPs? Why are we doing this? And the thing that brings me to this work is that when we do have evidence of positive impact on youth and families, it benefits us in the sense that we can avoid reinventing the wheel. I grew up with my mother my mother's a social worker, and she ran a small nonprofit, and the level of effort and dedication that we put into this work is there every day. And in my mind, evidence-based programs allow us to put energy and effort to where it's most needed, so that we're not reinventing the wheel when we're trying to tackle some of these most challenging problems, that we can focus on things like matching the EBP to the need and tailoring the services in the ways that we can to meet the client's needs. The next thing I think for all of us in this space right now is that it does attract and maintain funding. That's for a multitude of reasons, but I think it's important to consider. I think importantly, one of the reasons is that evidence-based programs, you can calculate the return on investment, which is a very interesting idea, but the idea that that good outcomes are also good use of investment. In terms of if I were a legislator trying to make some tough policy decisions, evidence-based programs lend themselves to helping support some of those tough policy decisions. The other important thing is that a well-articulated program of any sort, but EBPs in particular, help demystify the services for youth families and partners. You can tell them, you can share with a family right out of the gate what they can expect. The duration of services, what kind of benefits we hope that they'll see. And for those sort of practitioners who are delivering it, it often will provide a map that can be helpful and really support professional development, where they can focus on the competence piece because the adherence aspect is outlined for them. And so I hope that kind of might align with some of your own thinking about some of the benefits. I say all this though because I'm going to turn it now over to Bob, who is also going to tell you about some of the challenges and limitations, and kind of acknowledge there are some significant limitations that we're working together to overcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessie. Many of us have been doing this work for a long time, working with systems of care across child welfare and juvenile justice and education and lots of different settings in state systems of care, and have heard a lot of concerns about the use of evidence-based practice. We actually, my fellow panelists, some folks who are in the chat, I've noticed, have done this kind of work in different settings across the country. Dan Edwards, who's on the chat, has done a tremendous amount of this work. And there's a lot of concerns about EVPs that still persist, even though we've been doing this work for close to 20 years. People were concerned that they may be difficult to implement in real world settings or in community settings, that it's not addressing the underlying issues, or it's just a Band-Aid. It's just a sort of passing fad that folks are investing in, or that the EBPs might cost too much to implement or maintain. People are concerned that, some of the kids they see have complex problems, and the EBPs might be designed to address more simple problems that don't occur in real world settings, or they might feel that the kind of training that they've had in their background aren't valued. And so these kinds of concerns are very real. I think one of the things that I'd like to acknowledge is that when we've worked with folks and we've worked with systems of care, as they've begun to utilize evidence-based practices in real world settings, they've been able to actually see their value. And a lot of the folks, sometimes it's been interesting for me, that have been involved in implementation initiatives, start off with some of these concerns, and by the end, sometimes they're the strongest advocates for the use of evidence-based practice. So I think that we have to acknowledge these concerns. We have to really be able to speak to them, and we also have to be able to provide people with information and experiences that can challenge some of these beliefs. Next slide. Some other concerns that we hear are the issues of diverse populations, and some of the research that was done with evidence-based practices was not necessarily conducted with diverse populations, and so there's concerns about whether or not they're going to be culturally competent, whether or not they're going to be effective with diverse populations. I think when you begin to look at some of the practice-based initiatives that have been conducted in statewide systems of care, we can begin to address some of those concerns by looking at the outcomes in diverse populations. We also don't know that, we also know that it's not a one-size-fits-all. We know that EBPs may not work for everyone all the time in all settings, and it may work for some individuals better than others. And we need to acknowledge that it's not a magic pill that we can take. One of the things that I think we need to be careful of is not overpromising what evidence-based practices can do. And they certainly can address some real-world problems and challenges. They can be a public health intervention because we're raising the standard of care and standardizing treatment so that families coming from all different walks of life can expect a certain standard of care, but they're also not perfect. And we, of course, need to acknowledge that. And then I think we also need to acknowledge that there's a lot of good work that's going on in communities across the country that may have not been subject to doing a randomized controlled trial study, but that definitely have a lot of practice-based evidence to suggest that they're effective. And we need to do better and do more work investigating those interventions and recognizing what works in what setting. Can we do the next slide? And then finally, it's really important, and I could certainly attest to this, having done multiple statewide implementation of evidence-based practices. If we don't invest in appropriate implementation supports and really pay attention to things like training and fidelity and coaching and using data to help folks improve their standard of care, we're really going to not see evidence-based practices implemented with good effect. And so that's something we really have to be thoughtful about. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that later in our presentation today. And then finally, we don't want EBPs to suck all the oxygen out of the room, because there's lots of priorities within a system of care, and we can't invest all of our resources in EBPs. We have to think about the range of services and supports that children and families needs. So these limitations and some of these concerns are very real. We want to acknowledge those. We're not saying that evidence-based practice is the solution to everything, but we do feel like it's a very important part of the service array in building an effective continuum of services for children and families in a variety of systems. So I'll turn it over to Sue, and she's going to give you a little example about an evidence-based implementation in Colorado.
Thank you, Bob. I was just tracking the chat there, and I saw the comment that was just left by Beth Jordan about the importance of implementation supports. And I hope that this example will be responsive to some of the other comments that have been happening in the chat. So I love reading those questions. Keep them coming. I was invited today to provide an example of how we can scale up an evidence-based practice in a responsive way. And I have had the pleasure and honor of getting to work in Colorado in scaling up an intervention called multisystemic therapy. This is an intervention that is designed for adolescents who are about 12 to 17 years old, who are at high risk for being placed outside of their homes, usually juvenile justice settings, but other congregate care settings as well, because of their behaviors and or their substance use issues. This is an intervention that can be difficult to implement because it's done with really small teams of therapists, 2 to 4 therapists with really low caseloads so that they can provide that intensive level of service to the families. The families participate in the treatment for about 4 to 6 months, and they participate in a really intensive way. It's home-based and community-based intervention. Multisystemic therapy is considered evidence-based and well-supported on almost all of the registries that we'll be talking about in a little bit. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in 2016, it was obvious to the state that multisystemic therapy could really meet a clear articulated need that they were seeing, that many young people were having a first touch with the juvenile justice system. And those who were having that first touch were often having second and third and fourth touches as well. They were recidivating. And this was causing the young people to get further and further involved in the juvenile justice system. When they looked at where MST was available in the state, really noted that for the most part at that time, it was located in the urban corridors. For those of you that aren't familiar with Colorado, with the very exception of the 2 counties in the lower part of the state, the rest are what's considered the I-25 corridor, which is the road that goes north and south along the Front Range, just to the east of the Rocky Mountains. And that's where Denver's located, Boulder, and most of the other urban centers. And even then, if you look up at the lightly shaded box for Weld County, even where there was capacity, a lot of times there was not enough capacity. We knew that there were many more youth who could benefit from the intervention than were receiving it. So at that time, the state decided that they wanted to invest in increasing the number of young people who had access to MST, and decided to do this using a funding mechanism called Pay for Success. And so this meant that the state partnered with private investors, social impact investors, to be able to provide funding to support the pre-implementation and early implementation of the model, and basically work to get the sites to a point where they could reasonably sustain MST using more traditional methods later, like Medicaid reimbursement, for example. And of course, right now we're looking at Family First funding to round that out as well. But really to kind of be able to get communities over the hump of that challenge that people have in just getting started with these programs. Oh, yes. Okay, Heather, I saw your comment. I will get to that in just a minute. That's a great question. All right. So, so if we could go to the next slide. One of the things that we did was we did a RFP for our sites, and to get to some of the other points that were made in the chat earlier, kind of how do you combine readiness and context, community context, in a way that's responsive and also is matched with identified community need. And so the RFP process enabled sites to apply to be able to get the new teams, and they had to do things like demonstrate the need, but also demonstrate at least some capacity to be able to deliver the intervention in an ongoing way. Part of that, I think, we had extra funding in there for things like what Heather was asking about with recruitment. We know that that's, really hard. This was specifically designed to address underserved regions of Colorado. These are areas where there's not a huge population base and not a huge population of therapists that live in the areas as well to join new teams. And so we're able to provide some incentives to be able to get therapists excited and interested in applying to these new the new agencies, as well as provides for cohort 1, they have a couple years of funding. Cohort 3 only has a year of funding, because you can see how the project kind of titrated down in the years. But what it meant was the first at least year, but for cohorts 1 and 2, year and a half to 2 years, they were able to access free training for their staff. And that was really important because the agencies were brand new to the model. And so as they were kind of sorting out who's effective, who can deliver this model, who are the effective therapists, that can be hard to get right in the beginning. You might think, okay, this person seems really great, but are they a good fit for MST? And so that gave them more flexibility to sort that out. And all of our sites dealt with some turnover in the beginning, but I consider it positive turnover because the sites were really learning about how to make this work. And so if you spoke to any of them today, they would tell you that they have teams that look a little different than how it started, but they look just the way that they should, because they were able to identify people that were really successful with the model. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So, there you go. Thank you. So what we were able to achieve so far with that rollout that we have is we have almost 230 youth that have received MST so far with this new initiative. But what's really exciting is that at any given time, now that all these teams are up and running, we are having about 80 families in each month that are receiving MST across those 6 sites. Our early results are really promising. We've been tracking these. Of course, you may also observe that our implementation has crossed our COVID times that we're in right now. And we're really worried that we might see some declines in outcomes or declines in fidelity, just because of the reality of transitioning home-based services to telehealth supports. But we really haven't observed that. We've still seen really strong outcomes, a slight decrease in the in-school and working, and we think that's because kids are struggling a little bit more with the remote learning and there's fewer employment opportunities, but it's still within what we're really targeting. And then we also have been really checking to make sure that the families are engaged with the service and are participating. And we've only had a 3% dropout for the intervention over this period of time, which I think is quite remarkable. And then we've been tracking adherence as well. In MST, adherence is rated on a 0 to 1 scale, with anything over 0.61 considered being adherent to the model. And so we've been able to really maintain that through all of the changes that the past year or so has had. And so I think this project as a whole, that's fine. You can do it to the other slide. That's good. Thank you. Really exemplifies the importance of having that enabling context with the effective implementation and the effective practice. When you combine all three of those things together, you really do get striking outcomes. And I think we've been able to achieve that because we've been able to strike a balance between fidelity to the model and flexibility and attention to the unique needs. So just to continue with my example here, the project as a whole, it has a governance committee that oversees the project because of the funding mechanism that we have. And that relationship that we've been able to build in our governance committee to be able to flexibly, for example, reallocate funding for the project to be able to meet the needs that emerged because of COVID, specifically to meet some really, emerging needs around workforce and identifying therapists and those types of things was invaluable. So in any EBP implementation, there is that, I don't want to say tension because I think they live together, but the fidelity and flexibility dynamic can be really, really critical to be thinking about and how that plays out over time. If you could go to the next slide, thank you. So I think, hopefully this project highlights and we're going to break this down into more detail in just a minute. But some of the enduring lessons are, really having this inclusive decision-making being essential for success, that we had a lot of people supporting, helping to think through how implementation would be effective, making sure that you select an EBP that fits. And so that means that you start with that there's a need that the EBP is addressing, but that it also fits within the climate and culture of the agency and the community that it's being embedded into, that infrastructure is necessary to support the quality and value of intermediaries. So folks like myself who are supporting bringing a new program in, having that supportive infrastructure there is really, really important. And the quality and attention to implementation. I mean, I can't say this enough. I think, fidelity is the word that a lot of people use, but I think if one takeaway is the importance of focusing on really supportive implementation is key. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jessie.
Thanks, Sue. All right. I was actually wondering if Sue, I was wondering, I'm having a hard time like toggling between all my screens, but you were, I noticed you were looking at the chat. So I was wondering if we just want to take a minute or two to answer one or two of those questions that might have popped up.
Sure. Well, I can quickly answer.
I've been trying to answer a couple along the way, but I think, Sue, there was one that was directed at you in particular.
Oh, Heather, yes. A lot of time and training can be invested in implementing an EBP with staff. So staff recruitment can be challenging, turnover devastating. Yeah, so I think, what I tried to address with that particular question is, when we got the funding for this project to begin with, we really tried to build in supports for that to deal with turnover. And then how I typically, we had the pleasure of, an honor of having this funding to support this project, but with other implementation efforts that don't have the advantage with that funding, we always build in extra, we recommend building into the budget planning for turnover, because you're right, these types of programs can be extremely expensive. It looks like Suki also asked if we used the Hexagon tool for implementing support and guidance. We did not use the Hexagon tool expressly in this project because MST has a really robust quality assurance protocols that are part of the initiative. And so I think most of the activities would map well onto the Hexagon tool, but that wasn't specifically what we used for this implementation. Thank you for those great questions. Is there any others that I missed?
No, I think that was great, but I was just able to see the chat and seeing that there's a lot of comments about the importance of that kind of co-collaboration and partnership early. So I think that helps us segue really well to the next couple topics that we're going to cover. So what we want to do now is just really give you some tools, some guidance on really applying those lessons that we talked about. And as mentioned at the beginning, we are going to have a session dedicated pretty much to more or less each one of these topics in the next 9 months ahead. So we hope that if you're interested, you'll come join those. All right, so the first piece that we folks have commented on is this idea of partnership from the beginning. And what we see when we look at partnership around EBPs is that it's a complex place sometimes, in terms of implementation. You have your funders, your referring agencies, and those delivering the intervention. You also have your model purveyors, and Bob's going to talk to you about the role of intermediaries. So there's just sometimes a number of agencies involved. And then there's, of course, the youth and families that we're working to serve. But one of the things we wanted to call out in terms of that is this need for not just bringing all those diverse roles and partners together, but also engaging with those partners so that they bring staff who represent administration, supervision, case managers, therapists, because we really see a need to build. Ultimately, we like to see champions at all those levels for sustainability. And champions only come through that direct experience. They also bring the perspective that is really valuable in terms of sustaining and implementing well. So your supervisors and your case managers inevitably are going to have a little bit different and useful experience than your administrators and so on. So kind of building your teams to represent all that diversity and thinking. And some of my background involves implementing communities that care, where you're also doing this in partnership with some representative community agencies. So I think not only direct thinking about youth and families as individuals, but also thinking about community and how youth and families come together to be represented by community organizations. So how do you do? These are just kind of, I think, building an inclusive decision-making structure from the start. Some ways that we've seen be successful is to think about, using data to establish common ground. So that's one thing, I think, particularly when you're working to include youth and families, is ensuring that everybody has that nice common starting place for the conversation. And one of the ways to create that common starting place is through the use of data. I think it also helps build the next key component for that shared decision making, which is shared goals and shared commitment to goals. I think, and then probably the third thing that I would emphasize in terms of inclusive decision making is understanding that each of those roles really brings a unique and valuable expertise, either through lived experience or, as we talked about, the perspective in terms of authority and role in their organization. So just can't say enough about the value of bringing together teams at each of the stages of implementation. Really, we'll find that typically there is sort of a core group of folks that stick around throughout the whole implementation, but there's often a lot of change And that's okay. You start with a team that does the selection of an EVP, and you build and change over time through the stages, often including providers that might have been selected to implement the EVPs. So this just talks a little bit about the roles of the implementation teams, but that definitely includes championing the effort, using the data, the CQI systems we talked about earlier. It's important to continue to keep a close eye on that data from the beginning to more of a period of sustainability. The second lesson that Sue mentioned was this idea of starting with need. And I think from my experience, the importance of starting with really intentionality sets you up for success. And one of those really essential pieces of that intentionality is to look at need. So what that means is beginning with the concept of just understanding your own goals and desired outcomes and the population that you want to see have experienced that positive impact. That gets at the idea too of including the population you're hoping to impact in the process of that inclusive decision making right from the get-go. So the idea of having a theory of change and clear goals, and then looking at the interventions that exist, because the other concept that we see sometimes is that EBPs can be quite disruptive if kind of brought in a way that supplants currently effective services. So you want to really start with a good service inventory and understand where the gaps are. Because when you're filling gaps in services that are needed both to kind of address the broad array of needs that our families and youth have, then you're going to be much more likely to be successful. So just having that conversation in your local community about, does this EVP fill a need in our service array? And I think it's important to note in terms of identifying gaps, that there's gaps that can be considered just in terms of the services that don't exist. They can also be that the services exist, but they're not reaching the population. And then there's we talk about the need to think about they exist, but there's a gap because they're not seeing the outcomes that you want. So that's it does begin to allow you to challenge some of the maybe just typical ways of doing business, because we can consider a gap in results. And the last probably thing to note is that this idea of starting with need is transferable across systems, sort of the nonprofit agency or the potential provider, as well as at the clinician or practitioner level. So ensuring that a fit between, we'll talk later about kind of the frontline practice level change. It applies to when you're thinking about systems, this idea of having a fit between the need and the service that you're offering. So there was a question about the Hexagon tool. This draws on the Hexagon tool. These particular set of questions are borrowed from the Permanency Innovation Initiative, because they connect the idea of selecting. So number 3 through 5 here connects the idea of assessing the fit of the EBP with the overall kind of system need or the agency need in terms of theory of change. So things to assess would just be the things that we talked about initially, the readiness of the EBP for implementation. So what kind of supports are offered? The types of training, the types of coaching, is there a data system? And then how that aligns with your own, community, organization, and systems, kind of culture and way of doing business, or the way you approach things. And what's the capacity to take something on? And that could be all sorts of things. I know right now it's a real issue for folks. Their bandwidth for anything new is hard to, there's very little bandwidth. So but capacity is typically thought about things like, with COVID, but capacity is typically thought about things more like organizational capacity. Do they have the systems in place, the mechanisms and the staffing? And I think that this is our last piece, but when we're thinking about evidence-based programs and selection, it is important, I think, to be able to when you're looking at the programs and what they offer, to ask the questions of the model purveyors, which is what is the core elements of this model and what might be adaptable. So I'm trying to think of the example. So for example of this might be the idea of rewards. And some of the behavioral modification kind of programs, you'll see rewards as a part of the process of implementing the EBP. But those should be clearly adapted to what motivates the individual. So that's kind of just a minor example of the kind of thing that's both that, what's core to the model is this idea of a reward for behavior, positive behaviors you're trying to reinforce. And then what's peripheral is the types of rewards. Those should be self-defined by the family and the youth. So we're going to move in now to actually an activity. So hopefully you'll stick with me through this activity, because we're actually going to have you visit an external website. But we've mentioned before clearinghouses as a tool. And so here's the clearinghouse, some clearinghouses that I go to a lot, organized by kind of field or area: child welfare, education, juvenile justice, mental health, and then kind of cross-cutting children and youth services. We are actually going to move now into an activity where you're going to take a second. We're actually going to give you 5 minutes to explore a little bit the Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development Clearinghouse. And so if you click on the link, this link here, to specifically multisystemic therapy, which is the program that Sue had talked to you about, if you click on that link, it's going to take you to the website. And there's a fact sheet about the program right there. And I'm going to ask you to take 5 minutes. So it is 4:20. So, and Khalil is going to bring up a poll with 3 questions, these are the questions. What is the level, and you might want to, if you're toggling between screens like me, you might want to jot these down, but what is the level of certification or evidence rating for MST? You'll notice that Blueprints uses the certification of promising, model, and model plus. So those will be the options for how you can choose to say, what is MST according to Blueprints in terms of level of evidence. The second is, what age ranges does MST serve? And Blueprints approaches it so that they put it in bands. And so there's some age bands they talk about on this clearinghouse. And then I think Blueprints does a really great job about talking about whether or not the program is effective with different genders, races, and ethnicities. So go ahead now, click on that link, and as you find the answers, respond to the questions as they come up. All right. I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the second question in just a second, but let's reflect for a second on the answers to the first question. So what is the Blueprint level of certification for MST? And the correct answer is Model Plus. And this is something that Blueprints uses. Each clearinghouse has a slightly different way of talking about the level of evidence. And Blueprints has recently actually added the Model Plus standard, which means that it meets essentially a different standard because of independent replication. So, and that's an important concept when you think back to that, what I call the stair step slide earlier, where you really look at the strongest levels of evidence. And I think it gets to the issue that we hear from folks sometimes about, does this work in the real world? And so the more you have that level of evidence that says that this has been studied and worked in different settings and through independent replication, that kind of evidence helps with the ability to scale and the ability to kind of just have greater certainty that it'll work when you adopt it. So that's really the highest level of standard. And so that's you've got 70% of folks now who've answered, and so you guys got that right. All right. Okay, so question 2, these are actually probably maybe a little easier. What age ranges, and this is really according to the website there, what age ranges does MST serve? And is MST, and this is according to the website, MST equally effective with youth of different genders and races, ethnicities? Give folks one more minute, maybe not even that much, about 30 seconds. All right. So we did a little better with these 2 questions. That's great. So according to blueprints, so actually, so this is, this is one of the challenges of the clearinghouses, is they kind of organize things according to like the way they organize things. So yeah, MST is, it fits within these age bands of 12 and 14 and 15 and 18. So it's all the above. And is MST equally effective with youth of different genders and races, ethnicities? I really dug into the studies because, you always want to make sure this is right. And it really holds up. So they report yes, of course they would, but in terms of this, we can trust them. But it's good that they've done the work for us to really dig into that, and hopefully that can be a tool for you when you're looking for at programs and how to assess. All right, so I'm gonna move us along. This is what the polls we just covered. And I am now going to hand it back over to Bob, and he is going to talk to you a little bit more about the challenges we acknowledged from the beginning, but specifically how we can go about kind of helping you all with anticipating and addressing implementation challenges that you see.
I'm realizing that I'm like the challenge guy today.
You are.
But I guess having done this for a long time, I've pretty much seen it all. So that's probably one of the reasons why. I do think there's honestly some real world challenges, and particularly depending upon where you're joining us from across the country. And if you've had some experience with EVPs, but perhaps haven't taken on a statewide implementation, or you're not quite sure about the willingness of your stakeholders to engage in taking on implementing an EVP implementation, that there's a lot of real challenges we have to face. And we like to sometimes break them down into workforce challenges, economic challenges, and practice challenges. And in terms of the workforce challenge, I think there's actually a little typo in our first bullet. It's the staff may not see EVPs as compatible with their worldview. So they actually may say, this isn't how I was trained. I'm not really comfortable doing this. I'm not sure. A lot of our graduate programs, and we've actually, there's a lot of us that have tried to do work around this, but sometimes folks come out of their MSW programs or their counseling programs or their psychology programs, and they may have had limited exposure to utilizing an EVP, or limited experience using it in different settings. So they may find themselves working in a child welfare agency, or in a school setting, or in a community mental health center, and they maybe haven't applied using this, so they're feeling uncertain, they're feeling unsure. In most of our behavioral health agencies and in our child welfare agencies, we have really high turnover. And this is a challenge, obviously, for training as well. Sometimes we might be in the middle of training someone and they leave, or they move to another agency. So that's a real issue that we have to face. Sometimes we have people who might need to learn new skill sets. For example, a lot of evidence-based practices require at least the minimal comfort and use of using measures and data. And that might be new for people. They might be saying, hey, I wasn't trained to do this kind of thing, and this is new to me. And so it requires making that more comfortable. In fact, when we do our implementation initiatives, a lot of our work, we actually, when we're doing a year-long implementation, we focus on all the things around the skills, because the skills, you can train somebody the skills pretty directly, you could coach them, but there's a lot of implementation supports, such as helping people be more comfortable using data or seeing the value of looking at data, that can be really useful. And then we also, there's sometimes lack of incentives to change. Like, why are you making me do this? I'm already working these sort of crazy hours. I don't have time for lunch. I feel overwhelmed, and now you want me to learn something new. And so how do we incentivize folks to want to learn a new way of practicing, to learn new skills? Really this kind of question of what's in it for them and how to get people excited about it. In terms of the economic challenges in a lot of systems of care, we don't necessarily have the financial support necessary for both the implementation and the sustainability of changing practice. And hopefully with some of this new legislation, we may have access to some additional funding to do this work. I think it's really important. I mean, one thing I do hope you walk away from today thinking about is that this doesn't mean just sending staff to a training. We really have to think about how we create an environment and a context whereby we can, implement EBPs with success and sustain them over time. And that really requires paying attention to that implementation process. At times, our reimbursement systems aren't sufficient or adequate to reimburse EBPs and what goes into them. There are certain states that are taking that on and looking at that. Looking at things like enhanced rates or bundled rates for certain types of evidence-based practices, shifting from a state contractual model to a fee-for-service bundled model. There's lots of things that are going on across the country and examples of that. And then one of the things, we have a lot more evidence to suggest to help us understand this, but historically, we didn't really, it was hard to make the case of, you want me to invest all these resources and money and time in doing this now, and what are the long-term outcomes? Well, the good news is we've done enough large-scale implementations to really look at some of those long-term outcomes. Places like the Washington State Policy Institute have done some really great analyses on the use of evidence-based practices and their long-term outcomes, both in the monetary perspective, as well as looking at outcomes at the client and family level. And then, of course, at the practice level, it's hard. We got a lot going on, time issues. There's lots of mandates, and we know in child welfare in particular, wow, there is a lot of mandates. One of the most illuminating things I ever did was I was working on a statewide child welfare initiative that was funded by the Administration for Children and Families. And the goal was to enhance trauma screening and practice within the child welfare system. And we were working with child welfare providers, and we actually all went through our state SACWIS training, and we all went through the process that social workers need to go through and caseworkers need to go through. And my head almost blew off, because it's amazing when you actually go through the process of seeing what the mandates are on child welfare staff. We really realize the burdens that they're under. And so this is really a systems level thing that we need to think about in terms of streamlining and focusing on the aspects of best practice that are most important. And then there's all kinds of other issues. What are the politics, both at the state level, at the agency level? What are people's interests? It's really difficult if you don't have buy-in at multiple levels. So another example was I was involved in an initiative where we had a lot of buy-in at the commissioner level, but we didn't have the buy-in at the area office level. And that was a real killer. We really needed to engage those area office leaders who were the ones in the trenches to see the value of the systems change intervention. So that type of work is really important, and that speaks to a lot of the comments that we got earlier. And then, of course, having that leadership and buy-in at multiple levels is really important. So next slide. So just shifting a bit from the challenges to sort of how do we address these issues and how do we make it work? I really love to turn to the work of the National Implementation Research Network. They've done a really nice job with their active implementation frameworks. And it's a nice way to sort of talk about some of the types of implementation supports and frameworks that we can utilize. This happens to be their model, and we can talk about the role of implementation science across these different types of frameworks, looking at the different types of innovations that are available, recognizing that implementation occurs in stages and thinking about the supports that we need at those stages, looking at what the implementation drivers are, and I'm going to review those with you in a second. It's really interesting to think about it from that perspective, thinking about who our teams are at the local level, at the state level, at the regional level, and who needs to be involved in those teams. And then the work of implementation, a lot of it involves really looking at quality improvement and continuous improvement cycles. So we're gonna dive into that in a few of those in a little bit more detail. So I really like to think about the work of implementation as sort of what we see with these two guys who are holding on to each other for dear life. We kind of have this knowledge about these ideas, these practices, these best practices on one side, and then we have sort of, the practice world on the other. And how do we bridge those two? There's this gap in the middle, and how do we get from one side to the other? And I remember many, many years ago, I was beginning to do this work, and I was sitting at a conference, and someone started talking about the role of implementation science. And, and it was a really new term at that time. That's how old I am. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, Eureka, like this is what we're trying to do. We're really trying to think about how we get from here to there and what does that process look like. Fast forward many years later, I was actually at an implementation conference. And at that conference, they had put us into groups. And we were supposed to have sort of these practice communities. And one of the groups was called purveyors. And a lot of us in that group said, well, I'm not really a purveyor. I kind of do other things. And I remember I stood up in a discussion at the end in a room full of a couple hundred people and said, we really feel like we have to evolve the definition and really look at, thinking of ourselves more as an intermediary. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. And I remember the person who was facilitating said, that's great, Bob. Go ahead and do that research and figure it out. And I was like, oh, great. What did I sign myself up for? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I found after that process. So if we go to the next slide. So really when we looked at an intermediary organization, what we did was I operationalized these sort of 7 areas that intermediaries work in. And being a purveyor of an evidence-based practice is one of them, but there are a lot of other things that intermediaries did as well. So I surveyed about 70 different organizations around the world who are doing this kind of work to find out if this sort of model held up. And what we found was a very high rate of agreement amongst folks who are doing this work, that these 7 areas really describe in some ways the things that intermediaries do. But we also found that the intermediaries look really different in other places. So really, if you think about these roles and functions, they can, once again, have this core of being a purveyor of an evidence-based practice like MST or like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy or like a evidence-based prevention program. And over time, in many cases, the role of that organization evolves and changes. So they're going to get involved with quality improvement and research and evaluation. They may be raising public awareness about the value of those practices. They may be working with local providers in terms of best practice model development or adaptation of existing EVPs. They're providing consultation and technical assistance at various levels to state agencies, providers, systems of care. And then as they evolve, they also get involved in policy and systems development. So how do we create policies that support and sustain best practices within systems of care? And what we found was that there seems to be a developmental trajectory of intermediaries that does this work over time. And we will also see them working in a lot of different systems, some of which are mentioned here, like early childhood, behavioral health, juvenile justice, child welfare, and healthcare systems. So you see intermediaries working in lots of different places. We've looked a little bit at how they develop, and they develop organically in many cases, and they need to meet the needs of the local community and context. And we're going to be talking about this a bit more in future sessions. And if any of you are thinking that you either are a budding intermediary or you'd like to develop an intermediary, we're happy to help you talk with you about that and what that might entail. So our next slide. So diving in a little bit to those implementation areas, the drivers that were identified by NERN, and this has been fairly widely adopted. I would imagine probably a lot of people on this call have been familiar with this, but I think it's a really important component, a fundamental way of thinking about what's necessary for successful implementation. Because historically, if you look at this little triangle that's in front of you, we really focused on that left side of the triangle. We really focused on competencies. So how do we train people in learning the practices? And that was where we focused, but what we didn't focus on was what are the organizational factors that are necessary to successfully implement the evidence-based practice, and what kind of leadership do we need? And so this model, which you could read a lot more about in other settings, and we could talk to you about more in the future, we just wanted to introduce this idea to understand the multidimensionality of implementation, that it's not just about training someone in a practice, but it's also about attending to the organizational factors that are necessary in successful implementation, as well as looking at the leadership, both within the local system as well as in a broader system. So next slide. And then finally, a big part of successfully implementing evidence-based practice is looking at what you're doing and improving it. We really approach the work that we do through the lens that we're constantly trying to improve, and we're also trying to work with the systems of care or the agencies we're working with, also help them consistently improve. And one way of doing this is using implementation tools like things like plan, do, study, act cycles. So we're looking at these cycles of improvement. We're taking an idea, we're testing it out, we're tweaking it, we're improving it, we're implementing it again, measuring it, looking at it. And then if it takes hold and it works, we elevate that and implement it across the system. We've borrowed some of these strategies and ideas from other parts of the world, from some folks. I have a niece who is an engineer, and she is a Sigma 6 black belt. And it's really interesting because we have these great conversations where we are really talking about the same ideas about how improvement occurs over time. So a lot of this work is really rooted in years of experience in other fields, where we think about how to make small, systematic, and incremental improvements that can lead to significant and sustainable systems change. So I hope that when you walk away from this, you can recognize, not to be daunted by this, but to recognize that there are strategies, there are systems that can really help support the work that you're doing and help it be successful. And the other thing that I have found from having done this for many years is that it really also helps result in some other impacts in the system where people are talking to each other in different ways. People are sharing information in different ways. I remember doing a workshop once where we had our child welfare workers and our behavioral health providers who were serving the same families in the same community map their ways that families move through their systems. And then they presented to each other. And it was amazing because some of these people had worked together for 20 years and they never took the time to recognize the family's experience of moving through the behavioral health system and the child welfare system. So the way that things like using improvement cycles, looking at quality, looking at data and making improvements, and doing that across a system can result in some really amazing outcomes, not only in terms of like hard data outcomes, but in terms of improving communication, improving relationships, and creating a more effective system. So I think this goes back to you, Jessie.
Yes, great. So that was, we are going to offer, again, I'm going to make more plugs for these follow-up sessions because we're going to get a chance to dive into all the tools that Bob mentioned, to talk more about all of those the active implementation framework. And kind of moving along in terms of offering kind of some teaser slides. I've got 2 more slides, and this is one of them, and it talks about really a session we're going to do later on in our series that looks at how you support frontline practice change. We've been under a grant with Sue and I, with a grant from the Children's Bureau. I've been working on a project called Partnering for Success that has developed training and coaching for child welfare, and we've broadened it now to behavioral health and juvenile justice around these behaviors that help supervisors, administrators, and case managers, who are the referring agents or the care coordinators for families, really leverage EVPs through their behaviors. So it's just an under-attended to area sometimes, which is when you have a case manager who has the role of assessing for the family need, doing screenings, that's a very, very powerful and important step in utilizing EVPs, because you're making that initial assessment with the family of what service do they need, and then establishing the partnership with the service provider who's delivering the EVP and the family from the get-go. Really requires strong communication. And so those are the kinds of things we can help train on in terms of communication. So setting the standards that the case manager, the supervisor need to be able to communicate about the EVP that they're offering to youth and families, and answer those questions. Do the what we call sometimes a warm handoff, or basically facilitate the connection between the youth and family and the provider of the evidence-based service. And just doing those activities makes a world of difference in terms of success, in terms of engagement from the provider side, and then when you get to the piece about families getting to a place where they're really utilizing the service, completing the service, and that's also, there's a role for the case managers and supervisors in really supporting the application of what the family and youth is experiencing, in the home and in their school and other settings. And so there's a lot of there's importance in supporting that work as a case manager. So this is kind of what we're talking about when we talk about frontline practice. I think possibly the thing that we haven't talked about enough in the field is, when do you decide the service is not working? And so that would kind of be that last piece, is helping do the assessment and reassessment, and have the conversations with the youth and family about the impact that the service is having for them, so that you can adjust as needed along the way. So those are kind of a quick summary of that kind of practices that training and coaching is promoting. And we can talk a lot more about, how do we help case managers develop these skills and practices, in the vital role of supervisors, administrators, and the real practices of partnerships across those roles. And last slide, important for all of us, is how do we leverage existing funding? We, in the role of intermediaries, which all of us here today presenting play, we are working with public systems at the state and county level, often helping them better utilize federal funding to support evidence-based programming at the local level. And so these are just some, I think there's a great website. It's a little bit outdated, but the youth.gov connects you to a description of a number of federal initiatives that have prioritized evidence-based programming. Pew Results First did a nice brief on the ways that states, particularly state legislatures, have prioritized evidence-based programming. Sue referenced the Pay for Success model was a resource in Colorado. So that's something that's been new and different in the last maybe 10 years or so in this work. So we will talk more about those ways that you can leverage federal funding, state funding, and then my own experiences, I come from, my background is I've worked for the Annie Casey Foundation in the field of funding evidence-based programming. So there's also we can talk a little bit about the role of private philanthropy. All right, we are going to now take questions. I am going to stop sharing and see if I can take a look at this list of questions that people have generated. I wanted to say right out of the gate that there was some excellent feedback as I was speaking about blueprints. And so I think that, I should have acknowledged right from the start that we have not evolved to reflect our understanding of gender in that clearing, really in any of the clearinghouses, and nearly hardly any of the studies we're looking at to really reflect all the ways we're thinking about gender these days. So, and for many folks have thought about for a long time. So I just want to acknowledge that, and I appreciated that feedback. I am I'm trying to get the questions. I think I'm having trouble with this Google Doc situation, so I'm just going to take them from the chat, if that's okay. I saw one important question that maybe Sue or Bob could talk about, which is about when you have, the comment is really about when you're talking about like tribal communities that are, we talk about a small n, like a small number of those families are represented in the studies that have larger amounts of individuals participating. Just wanting to see that representation in terms of knowing that it's effective for tribal communities. And the comment was that there's folks who are doing research where it's within the tribal community. So I'm trying to look for the question in particular. It was from Katie, I think. I primarily work with tribal or operated social service providers in Alaska. The populations we serve simultaneously experience disproportionately harmful outcomes, but also are rarely considered statistically significant within a control research setting, and at best get a PAN, AI, and evidence-based acknowledgement. The lived experience of statistically insignificant diverse communities and their specific needs and strengths are consistently lost in the emphasis on RCTs. There are wonderful exceptions, but they're few and far between. And so the question is, can you address creative ways that mainstream EBP developers and researchers are using this to address this ongoing challenge?
I could just share one example that I've been involved with in the past, and that is, because this is a real challenge, obviously, and one of the challenges of research is that it's almost impossible to be inclusive of all communities, particularly some small communities. And we are lucky to have researchers that are trying to focus on those communities so we have more relevant evidence. But I do think that, we have found that many evidence-based practices, just because there haven't been a particular cultural group included in the randomized controlled trial, doesn't necessarily mean we should start from the point of assuming it's not going to work with a different population. But we do need to pay very close attention as we're implementing it to outcomes. And I think to local adaptations to make them more culturally relevant and appropriate. So a really good example of that is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy has been disseminated across the country in lots of different settings and lots of tribal settings. And there have been examples where, that model has been, the stages of that model stay the same. But for example, if you are using a relaxation strategy, you may use more culturally appropriate means of doing that. You may think about, some of the more standardized ways in which people are trained need to be adjusted to be more thoughtful, and also including, things like spirituality, in thinking about their relationship with ancestors, all those issues that are so important, in particular as we're beginning to understand trauma in particular for tribal people has such an important lens. So I think there are folks who are looking at those issues more carefully. But I think it's an example of a time when it's really important when we're thinking about using an evidence-based practice in that type of setting. We really have to work actively with the local community to help co-create the implementation and to make those adaptations that what may not impact the fidelity of the model, but are going to make that model more appropriate for the families that we're serving. And I do think also at the time of selection, we also need to consider whether or not there are some EVPs that would not be appropriate because of the cultural considerations, of that community. And that should certainly be part of the selection process as well.
Great. I'm just going to jump in and I'm going to go ahead and read off some questions that we had from the chat. And if it has been answered, I do apologize. We're just going to try to get to all of them as fast as we can. Can you speak to the human aspect of EBPs in general, as there is a people aspect to the implementation and not just a curriculum?
Okay, I wasn't sure who was going to jump in. Yeah, I've said this at the beginning of my career when I started as a clinical psychologist. There is always a place where art meets science. I don't think that you can take away the human nature of the work that we do. Even when we look at evidence-based practices, when we think about quality of implementation, of quality of service delivery, engagement, alignment with your clients, those are just as critical for good outcomes as the active ingredients that are inside of an intervention. So I think there's room for both. I had another colleague who used to always say, you still have to bring your brain to the manual, right? Like the manual shares with you what those components are, but you have to figure out how to bring your own voice in to create connection with your clients and make it come alive. And
the
I
would
other
even
side,
say
yeah,
you have to bring your heart too.
And your heart, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Implementing EBPs is sometimes approached from ground zero, training organizations up from a perceived lack of knowledge about the EBP in question. Do you have any thoughts about how organizational culture, proficiencies, capacity might be evaluated and used to guide the EBP selection process? Whoever has the answer can go ahead and answer the question.
I was wondering if about measure. I think it's a measurement question, like what if there's measurement tools. We're in the process right now. We're in the middle of a Center for Excellence in foster care grant, and we're sort of working in Maryland to select sites. And so what we have done, or in the process of doing, is just, I think for any initiative, like thinking, just really outlining for yourself what the critical capacities are in terms of organizational readiness. So, articulating the roles and being so the idea of practice profiles, even like really thinking of what are the roles that are critical to implement, and kind of co-collaborating around whether that capacity, to assess whether that capacity exists.
Can I just add one comment to that too? I think, when you have a new implementation effort, you sort of have one of two situations, right? You have maybe an identified need because you don't have a service available to meet that need, right? So you're training people to do something that they know they don't have the skill set for. And that's a different implementation process than if you're retraining people to do something kind of better, right, than what they're doing. And I think that's a lot harder because you're kind of implying that what they're doing maybe isn't as good as the new thing. And there's just a lot of additional readiness activities that need to be really carefully thought through when that's the circumstance of your implementation effort.
Okay, I will read one more and then that'll be the last question. Can you define the term intermediaries and the importance of this role?
Sure. So an intermediate organization is really an organization that helps facilitate the implementation of an evidence-based practice or program, or even more broadly, helps to improve the quality of care, helps us get from this idea of knowledge to practice, and helps us, kind of cross that knowledge to practice gap, and does that through lots of different activities, supports, implementation facilitation, consultation, coaching, all the activities that I mentioned in my description. And if you actually have more questions about that, we could send you some references. I've written a couple articles that actually define and talk about intermediaries.
All right. Well, I think Zalika mentioned that was our last question. So I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for participating today, for the thoughtful feedback and questions. We do look forward to seeing you at the next the February 4th Training Institute Live workshop, and then the EBP series that will follow. So thank you to my co-presenters, Dr. Franks, Dr. Kearns. Thank you so much.
Thank you.